My name is Pedro Gadanho, and I've been recently appointed the Curator for Contemporary Architecture at MoMA, at the Department of Architecture and Design. So actually, what I do here is both, of course, doing exhibitions, doing research for exhibitions, but also taking care of the collection, especially after 1980, in contemporary terms. So it's about thinking as a challenge, how do you represent architectural history through its production? How do you select people that are relevant? And how do you have a work that is representative? This for me was let's say, the biggest challenge, because that was what I wasn't so used to do, because I used to do curating as a freelance, and how it's not only that, but it's also not only thinking about trends, not only thinking about themes that deserve some exploration in terms of the medium of exhibition or film or whatever, but it's also about considering how and with what kind of examples do you represent contemporary production in a collection. I would say that architecture, rather than a service, like sometimes we consider it, and we have to consider it, rather than a social service, an economical service, a professional service, I like to think of architecture as being a cultural production. And that for me implies that could be taken more from the perspective of, the sociology of culture, understanding how architecture adds something onto human culture, how it adds to the discussion that we have regarding society and the idea of progress and so on. So for me, architecture is a contribution towards that. It is a discourse, it is a culture, rather than just providing a technical service. I would say that the profession is at its crossroads right now, in terms of what has been a modern definition of the architect and the role of the architect towards society, and the challenges we're facing currently as a global society. So in fact, I think we have looked at ourselves as architects as someone who would provide, with the latest technology available, with the latest knowledge available, to provide the best shelter as possible. And in those terms, obviously trying to represent the aspirations of society. But at a moment in which the lack of resources becomes somehow challenging, you have to maybe reconsider how we can use architectural knowledge in ways that go beyond just offering that service of providing shelter. So in fact, what I've been observing over the last years, which I think is quite interesting, is the move from architects being just considered builders to someone who can do a consultancy in terms of urban planning, who can think about strategies for the everyday, and can actually contribute into other areas of society that involve this spatial dimension, rather than just addressing the question of building. Being a curator is also carrying a critical vision, but through media that can reach wider audiences. And in these terms, curating is both a critical activity, a commentary on what is being produced in the field of architecture or other fields. But it's also about understanding or trying to identify where the production is going. And in those terms, it gets closer to what we call trend hunting and so on, which is trying to understand what is it that is changing, what is it that might represent new directions. And there, of course, innovation always comes in as something that at least represents a new step, some alteration in the form we act, in the form we understand architecture, for example, in the way we use technology, in the way we address social issues. So for me, innovation is not about producing the new as only purely the new, but it's about using again and again the knowledge that we have accumulated already to introduce alterations in the way we consider the practice. The fact that people used to be disciples of somebody and that would allow them to appear in a scene is probably being substituted by the ability to network, to create resorts of people, and to use the communication media in order to reveal your ideas. I think you can actually be not connected to the traditional, let's say, centers of production, of intelligence, of knowledge, and so on. And suddenly, if you know how to network, if you know how to use the networks, these two different dimensions of the word network, you may suddenly appear with the quality of your work. So even in terms of blogging and the internet and so on, I think it's very relevant that nowadays people can actually be recognized by the sheer quality of their work just because they manage to have these media that really reaches a lot of people. And basically what is important, or what becomes important, is the fact that there are ideas, concepts that are expressed in a powerful way, and then they are able to use these tools to reach people. The fact that I started my blog, and particularly writing in English, was clearly intentional, in the sense that coming from Portugal, which is a rather small country with a high focus on its own production, using the English language was obviously aiming at getting an audience outside my very local network. So for me it was a very important step to reach people and to make my work visible. And if I hadn't gone into that direction, probably there wouldn't be these opportunities as well to expand that way of thinking. But of course, there had to be some sort of thinking behind it. There had to be already some cultural luggage, some ideas to be put forward. It's not like, I think, that you're going to put something out there that is empty of content and that will be recognized. I think first there will have to be some sort of thinking system that has some consistency, that has some capacity to reflect on what's happening in the world, and then you have a tool which is totally new and absolutely fantastic, which is allowing that platform of thought to be shared by anyone who has access to a computer. Especially in terms of architecture, fighting specialization and looking for diversity. Because normally schools and courses offer this sort of diversity, but it's a responsibility of the people to really get this knowledge and cross this knowledge out of what they get from the different offers that you have in a school, and then have the ability to resist this idea that you're always focusing on architecture and looking also abroad and starting to have activities that establish connections between architecture and other forms of culture. Because I think this linkage is what sometimes is missing in contemporary academia. And I always remember the words of a very important Spanish philosopher, Ortega y Gasset, when he was talking about the barbarics of specialization, la barbarie del especialismo. being that he was suggesting that somehow, because we were tending to get more and more specialized in terms of professions, we were losing the wider context and the connections to the meaning of the world and of life itself. So I think because architecture is so connected to the everyday, so connected to qualifying our way of life and our environment, I think it's terrible when architects absolutely specialize in a certain number of tools and lose the bigger picture. So I think the school is very important to provide those initial tools, like the capacity to design in terms of progetto, in terms of being able to put together a number of elements to solve a certain problem, but then the way you do it will also have to be inspired by what's happening around you in terms of culture, in terms of life, in terms of politics, in terms of how society will change. A single line of activity was never enough, even in economical terms, to survive. So I could not leave off doing only architecture. I could not leave off only writing. I could not leave off only teaching or practicing architecture. So, in fact, I tried to combine these different activities. And what I found interesting was the fact that one would inform the other. I mean, one would be interesting for me to sort of get distance from getting too obsessed or too involved with a certain aspect, and to give me a different perspective on what I was doing. What I mean is that when I was writing, I would be getting a certain distance from practicing architecture and informing this practice of architecture with another way of thinking. And when I was doing architecture, I was probably also feeding and learning certain aspects that would reflect on the writing. And then curating would be also a combination of these different parts. So in fact, it was using one practice to inform the other, to enrich the other. And this is, I think, again, coming from this understanding of architecture as a production of culture, and the fact that we have to consider that there is this dimension to architecture, which is not only the response to a given problem. It's enriching that response with layers that manage to touch and communicate with many different people.